Habakkuk began this book by crying out to God because God had seemingly not heard his prayers concerning the evil and violence among the people of Israel. And God responded very provocatively by saying that he had indeed seen it and was raising the evil Babylonians to come and bring judgment on Israel. And so in chapter 1, verse 12, Habakkuk began his second complaint. How could you let the Babylonians get away with it? And in chapter 2, verse 4, God answered Habakkuk by saying that the Babylonians will not be spared of judgment. The arrogant will face judgment, but the righteous will live. Now, verses 6 to 20 here are a continuation of unpacking verse 4. If you thought God spent a long time describing how evil the Babylonians were in chapter 1, well, that is nothing compared to what he outlines for the future of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, here in this passage. It might help to think of this passage as a reflection on the first half of chapter 2, verse 4, and then chapter 3 as a reflection on the second half of verse 4. We're going to begin by looking broadly at the passage as a whole, and then we will add a couple of layers of depth to unpacking what's going on here, with 3 opportunities for questions to reflect on. Verse 6 is a bit of a complex introduction to this section in the way that it is worded in English, and that comes from the difficulties of translating from one language to another. There's a bit of nuance to some of these words that needs clarifying. Taunt is the word for proverb or wisdom. And you will notice throughout the rest of this passage, there are many proverb-sounding phrases. Next we have scoffing, which is really the word for parable, something that needs interpretation. When Jesus told parables, he invited people to reflect and consider their meaning to understand them. And the third word here is riddle, which is a bit more straightforward for us. It is like testing someone with a hard question. Now, if you just read this verse as is written, it might sound like it has this strong, negative, mocking tone. And while that tone is certainly present, this is not meant to be making fun of the Chaldeans. The primary aim of this is to be a piece of wisdom, a lesson of teaching that all students, whether that includes Habakkuk or the nation of Israel or even ourselves as we read this, that we all ought to listen hard to learn from this. Now, while it will make a mockery of the Chaldeans and how powerful they think they are, this is written primarily to warn us as readers to learn the lesson from the fate of the Chaldeans. Using words like taunt and scoffing highlight how ridiculous the arrogance of the Chaldeans really is. So what is the lesson here? What's the warning? Well, the rest of this passage is structured around these 5 woes. In verse 6, verse 9, verse 12, verse 15, and verse 19. Woe is not a bad word to describe what's happening here, but the word is more like an exclamation. It's like saying, aha, as in, aha, I got you now, Chaldeans. And we'll see that a lot of what the Chaldeans have been doing will now be ironically turned against them, and they will suffer much of what they have made others suffer. And so this passage divides up neatly into these 5 sections that each bring a different charge against the Chaldeans and a warning for the judgment that they will face because of their evil. And we will unpack each of these in a moment. So let's take a look at the content of these 5 woes. Firstly, what are the charges that God is bringing against the Chaldeans through this passage? Well, let's look at these charges. Verse 6, we have, "Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own." In verse 7, the charge is that he loads himself with pledges. This is another way of saying that they have been dealing in extortion. They would take a pledge, a commitment from someone as a future payment. Think of it like a bank charging ridiculously high interest rates on a credit card to trap people into a debt cycle. Accumulating pledges was effectively trapping people into slavery. Verse 8, you have plundered many nations. Verse 9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, which is this picture of building luxurious homes with stolen goods. Verse 12, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Verse 15, woe to him who makes his neighbours drink and make them drunk and gaze at their nakedness. Now this one might be a little cryptic. All through the Bible, experiencing God's judgment is often described as drinking from a cup of wine. You may recall when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, you remember he cries out, "If it is possible, take this cup from me," which was a way of saying, "Take this judgment for sin from me," which he was about to bear on the cross. Now, the idea that the Chaldeans made their neighbors drunk and gazed at their nakedness is this idea of bringing judgment on others and then looking at them suffering in the consequences. It's like beating a prisoner and then laughing at their wounds. And this draws also back on chapter 1, verse 7, where we saw the phrase that justice and dignity go forth from themselves, as a way of describing the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans have their own view of judging what is right and what is wrong, and they were seeking to bring punishment on anyone they deemed not in agreement with them. And then the last charge in verse 19, woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake. Now you'll notice that mostly the charges against the Chaldeans are expressed in this statement of woe in each of these 5 sections. And if we were to kind of summarize or capture the themes of each of these sections, each of these woes, it might be this. 1, stolen wealth. 2, the charge of injustice. That is, they have put themselves in lofty positions and abused their power over the weak and vulnerable. Thirdly, the charge of their violence. 4th, the charge of their self-judgment, that they have determined right and wrong for themselves. And 5thly, the charge of idolatry. Now, it's a broad list of charges against the Chaldeans. And notice the judgment that God says he will bring upon them. It is largely the inverse of the charge against them. I mean, he says to the Chaldeans, in response to your plundering of nations, you will be spoil for your debtors. You will be plundered by them. In response to your evil gain and injustice, the stones of those houses you built, they will cry out against you, and you will forfeit your life. In response to your violence, you will face the Lord of hosts. In other translations, it might say here, the Lord Almighty. It's a phrase that is a reference to the armies of God, who they will now face. And when the Lord of hosts comes, the Lord Almighty comes, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God, a glory of the Lord. A glory usually refers to God's physical presence. The idea being that if God and his armies fill the earth, there will be no place for the violent Chaldeans and their cities that are full of iniquity or sin. They will all be wiped out, is the implication here. In response to the self-judgment that you brought, well, the imagery of the drunk continues. And now you will be shamed, and you will drink that cup of judgment, and you will show your uncircumcision. Obviously, that's a reference to the nakedness that the Chaldeans were accused of gazing at in their enemies. It's the inverse of that. And it's a mark of humiliation. But of course, circumcision was also the physical mark of being part of God's covenant people. And this would further show them to stand outside of a relationship with God, that they were indeed those who were not upright, from verse 4. Now finally, the last woe doesn't quite follow the pattern of the others here. The section actually begins up in verse 18 before the announcement of the woe. And it speaks to the worthlessness of worshipping idols in a very similar way to many other parts of the Bible. It's quite likely that idolatry was seen as the foundational and perhaps the greatest problem, which then led to all the other problems listed previously here. And that may be why this is mentioned last in a way that makes it stand out and unusual from the others. That here is the pinnacle of all of your faults and evil. It all stems from idolatry. And the irony in this last woe is that the Chaldeans have worshipped silent wooden idols, things made by hands, and they've attempted to awaken them to speak. But in the presence of God, they will be silenced in all their foolishness and their folly. Remember that this whole passage is a reflection on the first half of verse 4, where those who are arrogant and puff themselves up will be shown as not upright as they suffer judgment for their evil. Well, before we move into chapter 3 in our next episode, it's worth us reflecting on how this part of Habakkuk answers Habakkuk's initial question. In his second complaint at the end of chapter 1, Habakkuk asks how God could remain silent and simply let the Chaldeans invade Israel. He said, "Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" And God answers through this passage to say that he will certainly not be silent and will not allow the Chaldeans to go unpunished for their own sin. You may have noticed that twice in this passage we see Lord in all capital letters, which we learned last episode is the translation for God's personal name, Yahweh. And so twice again here, God reminds Habakkuk of his larger plans and purposes, and of his faithfulness to the promises that he has made to his people. And in both these mentions, we have this fascinating contrast between God and humanity, whether it's the Chaldeans or Israel or even ourselves. Firstly, in verse 14, it says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." It is a promise that again affirms Habakkuk's confidence when he said back in chapter 1 verse 12, he said, "We will not die," because he trusted in this promise. And it is a promise that the earth will be one day cleared of all sin and violence and evil and suffering, and will be completely filled with the glory of the Lord. The presence of God will encompass everything. And while Habakkuk has in mind the preservation of Israel as a nation itself, and that's all he has in mind, God has far bigger plans in mind. God is thinking about the preservation and renewal of the entire earth. And Israel and Chaldea, they are just one tiny part of that whole plan. In verse 20, after silencing of all the gods of the Chaldeans or any other idol, we are given this picture of God in his temple, his dwelling place. And remember, we were just told in verse 14 that God's presence will fill the earth, that the whole earth has become his temple. And now here he is ruling on his throne, well above the power of the Chaldeans and well above the weakness of the Israelites. And the instruction we are left with in the final phrase here is quite startling. Let all the earth keep silence before him. That is, God is far bigger, far more powerful, far more patient, far more just than you, Habakkuk. And just as someone like Job was silenced when God questioned where Job was at the beginning of time, so Habakkuk is silenced by the command to be still and know that I am God. Let all the earth keep silence before him. God has shown here that he does not treat the sin of the Chaldeans lightly, and they will face judgment in God's good timing. And God, in his infinite wisdom, who is from everlasting, as Habakkuk said in chapter 1, verse 12, God can and will use the evil and despicable plans of nations like the Chaldeans to bring about a total cleansing of sin and to restore a faithful remnant of people who are saved by grace, who do know God, and who live by faith as his people in the way that he had designed humanity to live. And it is this truth that Habakkuk will reflect on in his prayer in chapter 3.